thank you so much, Ed, for that very, very, very kind welcome. And it's so lovely to join you all here this evening for this very auspicious event, to have joined you for some of the conference that has taken place already today. I also like to thank the sponsors for putting on this lovely occasion and for allowing me to join you. Your wonderful dean, JP, has lent me his watch. I should say I'm not an academic. I have served as a politician for the last 10 years, and we like to talk. So I have this watch here to try and keep me to time so that we might take some questions at the end. You'll notice on this opening screen that it has my Twitter handle. It's also my Instagram handle. Please do, if you'd like to continue the conversation afterwards, if you're on social media, please do use that over the course of either this evening or after tonight. I will begin, and I hope that this is going to work. I've been asked to share with you my experiences as a Member of Parliament. I served for just shy of a decade. I was elected to Parliament at the age of 28, which is quite unusual in Britain, and I think even more unusual here in this country. And I cannot believe I stand before you this evening as someone who has been and was an elected representative for all of that time. We'd asked to share with you my experience about, sadly, the rise of anti-Semitism that we've seen in the UK. And in the hour that we have together, I want to share just, unfortunately, some of the lowlights. There are so many, and if reflecting on this story, it's quite extraordinary. I'm only going to be able to share with you just a snapshot of some of the things that have happened, certainly over the course of my time in public life. But I do want to try and end on a positive note, and so, as you can see from the title of this discussion, I want to conclude with a number of lessons that we can draw on, perhaps to focus positively into the future. But just to say as a disclaimer, just to reinforce the point, I'm not an academic, and I just share with you this evening my very personal experience. I know over the course of the conference there are academics in this room who are a lot more learned than I am on the academics of this experience. We start with an extraordinary event. This was in March 2018, and it's an extraordinary event because it was a demonstration that took place outside of our House of Commons. If you can just about see that's the House of Lords on the far right. If you look at the bottom photograph, you can't quite see, but Big Ben is just to the left. And that is me speaking in a demonstration where there's around 1,500 people that had gathered with just a few days' notice. It's a rally in Parliament Square. And there were many people that attended that event, many members of Parliament, many members of the public, and our slogan at that event was "Enough is enough, Dayenu." But we're not protesting here about financial cuts to public services or against Brexit. We are collectively protesting at this event against anti-Semitism inside the Labour Party. Now, we call the Labour Party at this moment Her Majesty's Opposition, the main party that opposes the party in government. And just to be clear, that has nothing to do with the Queen. But the title signifies the standing of the main opposition party in our country. And it was astonishing that the Jewish community, Labour members and supporters were driven to organise such a protest in such a significant location against a party of which I was a part and against its internal racism. And for the people that I've spoken to, we believe that this is an unprecedented event in Britain's last 100 years, that a minority community would take to Parliament Square to demonstrate against one of the two main political parties. Now, if this was a movie, you would freeze the frame and there would be a voiceover saying, I bet you're wondering how on earth we got here. So I'm going to try and tell you in the short time that we have to get together about how we did, in fact, get here. I was elected as a Member of Parliament in 2010 for the first time. As I mentioned, I was 28. I was much thinner in that photograph. It was one of the greatest privileges of my life. I should say I was supported into putting myself forward for public office via an organisation very similar to Emily's List that you have here. In my country, we call it the Labour Women's Network. And they provided me with the skills and the confidence to put myself forward. I think I envisaged doing it a little bit later. We, in 2009, had the expenses scandal, which meant that many members of Parliament decided not to run again because there were some difficulties that they encountered. My predecessor didn't have any controversy with her expenses, but at the time they were suggesting that MPs would not be allowed to have a connected party work alongside them. And her partner had run her constituency office, her district office, for 10 years. And the prospect of them not being able to work together meant that she didn't run again. And so I put myself forward. I was a plucky 28-year-old. I was a massive outsider in the selection, which is similar to your primaries, and I was not expected to win. So this was supposed to be my trial run. I was against, my main opponent was supported by all the big trade unions. She was the chair of the local party, the local Labour Party. And everyone thought that she was going to win, and I worked really, really hard, and I won. And so here I am. This is me doing the acceptance speech at 4 a.m, because we do our counts right into the middle of the night, and this is me winning as the newly elected member for Liverpool Wavertree. And if I wanted to, I could have been the Member of Parliament for Liverpool Wavertree for the rest of my life. It's probably one of the safest, or it certainly is, one of the safest Labour constituencies in the country. And at the last election in 2017, I had just shy of 80% of the vote, and a majority of around 30,000, which is a pretty hefty majority. I was elected and I threw myself into my new responsibility as serving in public office. I was appointed to the front bench. Ed Miliband was our leader at the time. I was the Shadow Minister for Energy and Climate Change for 3 years. I was then appointed as the Shadow Minister for Public Health. I should explain, in our system we have ministers that shadow the government ministers, but it's an additional level of responsibility. It's a cohort that has to do more and is in the media and is doing things every day. And I was then appointed to the Shadow Cabinet, where I served as the first ever Shadow Cabinet member for mental health. I raised many issues. I was able to change laws from opposition. I ran the campaign in our country to outlaw smoking in a car if you have a child in the back. So we now have a law which means that you are not able to do that. In 2010, when I was first elected, we had a growing issue of food poverty. And in 2012, I had the first debate in Parliament about the increasing use of food banks. It was a phenomena in our country. At that moment, we had around 300,000 people who were accessing emergency food aid on behalf of themselves and their families. Sadly, today it's now over 1 million, and I regret that I wasn't able to do more to contend with that very, very serious issue. I was also very, very involved in many health issues, and in fact, from 2013 onwards, that was my area of speciality. Before I was an MP, I'd worked in our National Health Service. As I said, I did a lot of work around public health and how, as a country, we should be doing more to keep people well rather than treat them when they're sick. And that's still very much a very big priority of mine. Certainly in the UK, we have a system that focuses far too much on what we do when someone's in a crisis or when they find themselves very unwell. And actually, when we're increasingly contending with lifestyle-related disease, there's so much more that we can and should be doing. So that was one of my areas that I've done a lot of work on. I sat for the last 3 years, I sat on our Health Select Committee, and that's the main parliamentary committee that holds the government to account on the £120 billion they spend every year on our National Health Service, which we can have a separate conversation about that afterwards. I think some people in your country call it socialised medicine, but it's not. And certainly when I got into public life, I was very, very proud of my Jewish roots and my Jewish tradition. I grew up in a very close-knit Jewish family. I had a bat mitzvah, I've been to Israel, I'd been involved in many youth movements as a child, I served and worked, we have an organisation called the Union of Jewish Students in the UK, it's very similar to Hillel here, I was a leader within that. Very, very proud of my Jewish roots, but I certainly didn't get into politics to become increasingly described as the Jewish Labour MP, or sometimes even the Jewish MP. And that towards the end of my tenure is what I experienced on the news ticker on BBC News or even on the Sky News ticker. My mum would be very proud to have me on the ticker, but not so delighted to have the word Jewish in there in a way that other members of Parliament didn't have their faith attached to their name. And of course, like unfortunately too many people, Jewish people in public life, I was subjected to anti-Semitic slurs, anti-Semitic insults, and anti-Semitic images. These often coming from the far right, and I'm just going to share with you at this moment. I'm in a very unusual position. We think probably the most unusual position in the United Kingdom of having seen not one, not two, but 6 people convicted of the anti-Semitism and the death threats that they have directed towards me. My remarks are going to focus on the left, but it's at this moment that I share with you of those 6 convictions, 4 of them have come from people from the far right. It's not a competition. And I should say that, regrettably, we expect it from the far right. What I'm going to focus on is on the left, which, I joined the Labour Party as a wide-eyed ideological student, drawn to the values of equality for all and anti-racism against all. And those were the very values that the party that I joined today betrays, which is why I came to leave it, and I'll talk about that. But just to reflect on the 4 convictions that I saw one person convicted because they put on social media images of myself with a Star of David superimposed on my forehead with the accompanying hashtag Hitler was right. That person served a month in prison for that and many images that they shared, which then precipitated an international anti-Semitic response, which was orchestrated by a website in this country called the Daily Stormer, which I think has been taken offline at the moment. And from that website, in 2014, they initiated a campaign to free Garen Helm, who was the individual who was convicted and sent to prison. And forgive me for the language, but just to share with you, it's pretty horrific. The campaign had the accompanying hashtag filthy Jew bitch, and that term was attached to, in just 3 days alone, 2,500 messages that bombarded me from every social media channel via my inbox. Some of the stuff was actually sent in the post. That happened. I then went on to see a young man called Joshua Bonehill Payne, who'd, in fact, his blogs still are online today because, unfortunately, because of the laws in this country, means we cannot get them taken down. He was convicted to 4 years in prison for the stuff that he put online, which was not only anti-Semitic, it was very violent, it was pornographic, it was misogynistic, and because of the content that he put online for that, meant that he went to prison. I'm sorry to kind of reel this stuff off, but I think it's important that you hear it. We had the very serious tragedy in our country in 2016, a week before the referendum about Brexit, where we saw one of my colleagues, a friend of mine, a member of Parliament called Jo Cox, she was murdered on the streets of Britain. And in the wake of her murder, just 2 weeks later, someone sent me a picture of a machete and told me that I was going to get it, like Jo Cox did, because of my Jewish faith. He was found. Unfortunately, he wasn't very clever by the means in which he shared that with me. He went to prison, and in fact, he's now serving a second prison sentence for threatening people in similar ways. There was a 4th individual who threatened to kill me in a bail hostel he was in, having already served a prison sentence for possessing a pipe bomb. He threatened to kill me in that bail hostel, and unfortunately in Britain, if something happens in a bail hostel, the strength of the witnesses isn't seen to be robust enough to actually hold someone to account for that. So he today is in prison, not for the death threats that he made towards me in a bail hostel, but because he did that, his equipment was seized, his mobile phone and his computer, and the police were able to find that he downloaded terrorist material. So he today serves a prison sentence in the United Kingdom under our anti-terrorism legislation, and who knows what he might have done with the information that he was able to access online. There's others, but those are the four kind of unfortunate, the very difficult ones that have come from the far right, and there's another one currently going through our Crown Prosecution Services in the UK. I'm sorry to kind of focus on that, but I just think it's important that you hear just some of the experiences that I, and not just me, but others have been subject to. But if I come back to the Labour Party, there have been very many Jewish Labour members of Parliament that have preceded me, including women Jewish Labour MPs since the 1920s. Not many people have heard of this lady. This is Marion Phillips. She was the first ever Jewish female MP. She was actually born in Australia. She came to England and she was elected as the Labour MP for Sunderland in the 1929 election. It was a very short-lived parliamentary career. She lost her seat along with, unfortunately, most of her Labour colleagues at the 1931 general election. But she holds two electoral records as being both the first ever Australian woman to be elected to a national parliament and the first ever Labour Jewish woman to be elected as an MP. And since then, as I said, many Jewish people have been elected as Labour MPs, including this gentleman, who is Manny Shinwell. He was my great-uncle. He served on a number of different terms in our House of Commons. And it was on the 4th of April 1938 that a Conservative MP on the other side of the House of Commons, a man called Commander Robert Tattenbauer, who shouted across the chamber to my great-uncle Manny Shinwell to go back to Poland, which not only my great-uncle but many others took as an anti-Semitic slur. So my great-uncle crossed the floor of the House of Commons, which is a no-no. You're not supposed to do that. It's against the rules. And I don't approve of violence, so I won't say exactly what he did, but he was an amateur boxer. And let's just say that the other guy needed hospital treatment. And they were both forced to apologise. And you can read that episode. It's in the text of Hansard, which captures what's happened in our House of Commons. Manny Shinwell later went on to serve as what was then called War Secretary, now called Defence Secretary, and Minister for Defence, which seems appropriate. And very similar to, I understand, it's not quite the same because it's less organised. I understand that there's a Jewish caucus within the Democrat Party, and within the Labour Party there was an affiliated Jewish organisation which is today known as the Jewish Labour Movement. For many years previously, it was known as Poal Zion. It's this year that the organisation, the affiliate, is due to celebrate. It's questionable whether it will be a celebration, but it is due to celebrate its 100th anniversary as an affiliate of the Labour Party. And I just kind of share all these different elements to, I suppose, share with you that my point that for many decades, Britain's very small Jewish community, because today we are just 300,000 people in the population of over 65 million, has always felt a home in the Labour Party. And in fact, you heard in the introduction before me that it's true, you'd get, along with your bar mitzvah, you'd get a membership card. The Jewish community historically voted for the Labour Party. They served it at both the local and national level, and very much saw it as a natural ally in the fight against poverty, discrimination, and racism. And this is unsurprising, as the party has historically held at its core the values of anti-racism, equality, and social justice. And if you're a member of the Labour Party, those values are inscribed on the back of your membership card. And it was those very values, as I mentioned, that led me to join the party as a student. But it was in 2019 that polling told us that a staggering 87% of Britain's Jews believe that the leader of the Labour Party and the potential Prime Minister was an anti-Semite. A staggering figure. So what changed? What happened? In short, it was the election in 2015 of Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party, and with him came an influx of tens of thousands of people into the Labour Party to support him, many from other parties and groups. It was a process of entryism, and it brought into a mainstream party an extreme set of ideas and ideology. What we saw was the mainstreaming and the institutionalization of a set of anti-Semitic ideas and tropes. Some were ancient, some modern, all fueled by racism, ignorance, and hate. And just to explain what that ideology is, it's simply put the West, and especially the USA, and its institutions, such as the UN and NATO, are the bad guys. And it's those bad guys that are responsible for neo-colonialism, neo-liberalism, and all manner of evils, including the State of Israel. For those people, they believe that it's a European colonial enterprise designed to support Western interests in the Middle East. And if that's what you believe, then so much bad stuff then flows from it. Conspiracies, lies, insults, the suspicion that Jews are agents of a foreign power, that Jewish people have dual loyalties, or else those older conspiracies of controlling the economy, controlling the media, and controlling our political systems. If I reflect on just so much of the abuse that has been sent to me via people that hold those views, I mean, the list would be like literally 20 pages long, but just a few of those things that they say. I've been called on countless occasions the MP for Tel Aviv. I've been told that I'm an Israeli shill. I've been accused of taking money from Mossad and the Israeli government on countless occasions. I wish that was the case. I'd be wearing better shoes. And even though I'm no longer elected, it still continues on social media today. I have on my phone about 45,000 photographs. I'm proud to say that a lot of them are pictures of my kids. But I also have thousands of screenshots on my phone of the social media posts that have been directed towards me. This is just one that I just happen, I mean, I try and do it less so. I'm obviously not elected anymore. But this is just one that, excuse the language, but this is just one that was in the last week. Both is something directed to myself and another now former Labour MP. Ruth Smith is also a former Labour MP. We all were not re-elected at this past election in December. As it says, we represent foreign countries' interests rather than their constituents. LFI and CFI, they're basically saying that it's Labour Friends of Israel or Conservative Friends of Israel, basically saying we are first and foremost loyal to Israel, another country, rather than our own. And the challenge is that this individual is a card-carrying member of the Labour Party. And these comments all too often have come from either card-carrying members or people that say or purport to be supporters of the Labour Party. These are people that are supposed to be on the progressive left of politics. We know that this anti-Western politics has its roots in the 1960s counterculture, in the endless iterations of Marxism, Leninism, and the strains of Trotskyism that swirl around British and European politics. And in Jeremy Corbyn, these kind of politics found a leader, they found an enabler, and they found a champion. Now, some will say that Mr. Corbyn is just a decent old-school socialist, that he is unfairly maligned by his critics. So I just want to share with you the evidence. Certainly, Jeremy Corbyn is a self-declared anti-racist. He has attacked anti-Semitism on many occasions, but usually with the caveat that he is against it along with all forms of racism. So this is certainly not the overt anti-Semitism like we see from Hungary's Viktor Orban. Indeed, it is a series of words and deeds that stretch back many decades that aggregate to present an overall picture. Jeremy Corbyn has had a long association with terrorist organisations, such as the Ihra, as they bombed Belfast, London and other UK cities. At a meeting hosted by the Stop the War Coalition in 2009, Jeremy Corbyn said he had invited friends from Hamas and Hezbollah to an event in Parliament. He was recorded saying, and I quote, "It will be my pleasure and honour to host an event in Parliament where our friends from Hezbollah will be speaking. I've also invited our friends from Hamas to come and speak as well." I think to use the word friends once might be dismissed as a slip of the tongue, but to say it twice shows intent and purpose. It came to light that Jeremy Corbyn had been present at a 2014 wreath-laying at a cemetery which contained the graves of many Palestinian activists, including Salah Khalaf and Atef Beseso, both of whom were members of the Black September organisation and were the masterminds behind the Munich massacre of Israeli athletes at the 1972 Summer Olympics. At the time of this event, Jeremy Corbyn wrote in his regular column in the UK's communist daily newspaper, The Morning Star, that wreaths were laid at the graves of those who died on that day and on the graves of others killed by Mossad agents in Paris in 1991. Both those masterminds were assassinated, one in Tunisia in 1991 and Beseso in Paris in 1992. Now, Jeremy Corbyn claimed that he was present but not involved at this event. I don't know what you think this picture looks like to you, but to me that looks like more than just being present and not involved. He later said that after causing unbelievable hurt and outrage, because these images surfaced in the British press, he said that he was there because I wanted to see a fitting memorial to everyone who has died in every terrorist incident everywhere. Now you can judge for yourselves from this picture how true you think that is. Now, many of his supporters will say that he is a man of peace, seeking through dialogue, a peaceful settlement to some of the world's worst conflicts. And there are even some of his supporters who make the claim that he played a part in the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. He played no such role, and that he holds the Nobel Peace Prize. He doesn't. The problem with this man of peace line is that, as his record shows us, he has only ever spoken to one side in a conflict. It's only ever been to the IRA, never to the Unionists, only to Hamas and Hezbollah, never to Israelis. It was in 2013 at an event organised by the Palestinian Return Centre that Jeremy Corbyn praised the Palestinian ambassador to the UK for a speech that he'd recently given to a parliamentary group. Corbyn also criticised the reception given to the Palestinian ambassador's remarks by some members of the audience, who Jeremy Corbyn called thankfully silent Zionists. I'm going to play you the clip of what Jeremy Corbyn said.
The other evening we had a meeting in Parliament in which Manuel made an incredibly powerful and passionate and effective speech about the history of Palestine, the rights of the Palestinian people. This was dutifully recorded by the thankfully silent Zionists who were in the audience on that occasion, and then came up and berated him afterwards for what he had said. They clearly have two problems. One is they don't want to study history, and secondly, having lived in this country for a very long time, probably all their lives, they don't understand English irony either. Manuel does understand English irony and uses it very, very effectively. So I think they needed two lessons, which we can perhaps help them with.
That's Jeremy Corbyn telling people, British Jews, that they don't understand English irony. And that's a very classic othering of Jewish people. In this formula, Jews do not equal Englishmen and English women. They are somehow alien, even if they are born in the UK. Now, at the time when that video surfaced, and all credit, I think there's many academics and people across the world who have spent a lot of time trying to find all of these sources. I tweeted that video of the leader of Labour Party is essentially him making inexcusable comments. Jeremy Corbyn, that video surfaced, and his comments were then defended by his party spokesperson. And I went on to say that those comments make me, as a very proud British Jew, feel unwelcome in my own party. I've lived in Britain all my life, and I certainly don't need any lessons in history or irony. Another big issue that occurred under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership was about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. I'm not going to go into all the background about the IHRA definition. It's something that our country signed up to along with 32 other nations. It was agreed in Bucharest in May 2016, and it's a working definition of anti-Semitism. It's non-binding, which includes 11 examples of manifestations of anti-Semitism. They're very practical examples to evidence what anti-Semitism looks like and what it feels like, including the use of stereotypes of Jewish power and control of the media, denying the Holocaust, or accusing Jewish people or the State of Israel of inventing or exaggerating it. Those are practical examples that are included within the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Yet it was in the summer of 2018 that the Labour Party's National Executive Committee, its highest body, dominated by supporters of Jeremy Corbyn, they were considering what to do with this IHRA definition, and they were contemplating dropping a number of those 11 examples. They said that the Labour Party had its own version of a definition of anti-Semitism, which they wanted to adopt instead. And that was despite the fact that there was hundreds of organisations within the United Kingdom that had already adopted that definition of anti-Semitism in its entirety with all of its examples. It was a few months later that the Guardian newspaper reported that there were 68 rabbis from across the religious spectrum, right from Reform through to ultra-Orthodox, that had taken the unprecedented step of coming together when quite often they couldn't agree on things internally, but coming together in this instance to write to the Labour Party ahead of its National Executive Committee meeting about this IHRA definition. And it was a very, very rare moment of rabbinical unanimity. Imagine 68 rabbis agreeing on anything. They agreed, they came together, and they said in their letter that by claiming to know what's good for our community, the Labour Party's leadership have chosen to act in the most insulting and arrogant way. And they implored the Labour Party to accept that definition of anti-Semitism in full. When the Labour Party National Executive Committee met just a few days later, one long-standing ally and supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, a man called Pete Williamson, he was elected onto the National Executive Committee, he claimed that those 68 rabbis, not 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, 68 rabbis that were protesting against Labour anti-Semitism were in fact, in his words, Trump fanatics, and that they should be ignored, claiming that he had never witnessed any anti-Semitism in the party. He was secretly recorded, and it was a few months later that we heard about what had happened, but a few months later someone had recorded it and it was released to the media, and you can hear what he says in this meeting, and it's pretty extreme and unpleasant, but I'm going to play it for you.
Social media very easily, and some of these people in the Jewish community support Trump. They're Trump fanatics and all the rest of it. So I am not going to be lectured to by Trump fanatics making up information without any evidence at all. So I think we should ask the 70 rabbis, where is your evidence of severe and widespread anti-Semitism in this party? Let me ask you a question. How many people in this room have seen anti-Semitism in the Labour Party? Put your hands up. Well, John, you've had anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. I've certainly never seen it. Please. Okay.
sorry to play that to you, but that kind of shows you what was happening at the very highest levels of the British Labour Party, that in this closed meeting of its National Executive Committee meeting, this representative was going on a rant. No one challenged him on what he was saying. People put their hands up to say, yes, they had seen some of this anti-Semitism, but his rant was allowed to continue. While that member eventually, because of the press furore that came as a result of that recording, that man was still re-elected just a few weeks later onto the National Executive Committee again, with 70,321 people voting for him in the wake of that recording. And even after 3 months of campaigning and very, very negative media exposure for the Labour Party on this very specific issue of the IHRA definition, Jeremy Corbyn still arrived at the last meeting where they were going to decide what to do with his own version of what anti-Semitism meant. Now, because they hadn't organised properly, in the end he didn't get it passed, but it wasn't through want of trying that even after what for me had taken up every single waking moment of my life to try and battle things from within and to get this accepted, he still tried to put forward his own version of what anti-Semitism meant. And in fact, even when that was adopted, Channel 4, which is one of our main television channels, they do a fact check, and they did a fact check to show that the Labour Party, there was still no evidence of the words of that IHRA definition being adopted or appearing anywhere in the Labour Party's 2019 rulebook or in any other document related to tackling anti-Semitism. The issue of anti-Semitism was in the Labour Party for long before 2018, and I just kind of refer back to what happened in 2016 when Jeremy Corbyn appointed this lady. Her name's Shami Chakrabarti. She previously ran Liberty, which was a human rights organisation in our country, and he appointed her to run what was supposed to be an independent inquiry into anti-Semitism, and that served as a tool for him throughout from 2016 onwards to say, look, we're dealing with anti-Semitism because we had this independent review. Now, our Parliamentary Home Affairs Select Committee did their own inquiry into anti-Semitism and branded the report that was ultimately released by Shami Chakrabarti as a whitewash, that it actually didn't contend with any of the issues to do with anti-Semitism. It then transpired that Shami Chakrabarti was appointed to our House of Lords. So in the UK, our House of Lords, which is like your Senate, people are not elected, they're appointed, and Jeremy Corbyn appointed her to a seat in the House of Lords, having conducted what was supposed to be an independent inquiry into anti-Semitism. And despite her being asked on repeated occasions at what point she knew she was going to be offered what we call a peerage, she never answered the question. And in fact, if you go to YouTube, I wasn't able to get it for this event, but you can see an interview with her where she's like hiding behind the glass because she doesn't want of water, because she doesn't want to answer the question about when it was exactly that she was appointed, or she knew she was going to be appointed to our highest house, our House of Lords, as a result of conducting what was supposed to be an independent inquiry. And it was at the launch of this very report into anti-Semitism within the Labour Party that there was a man in the audience, a man called Mark Wadsworth, who himself was anti-Semitic during the course of the event. He accused one of my colleagues, a Jewish Labour MP, Ruth Smith, of colluding with the media at that very event. That is an anti-Semitic trope, according to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. My colleague, she left the event in tears. It was captured on the cameras by Sky News. Again, you can watch it if you'd like to. And witnesses were shocked to see that Jeremy Corbyn, who was watching this all from the platform, did nothing to intervene. And he even chatted to the man who was responsible, Mark Wadsworth, at the end of the event. It then took a year through the complaint system, despite many people who were witnesses to the event, to actually lead to what became a hearing. It was a public hearing. We had to walk across. That's Ruth Smith on the left, that's me in the middle. There was other MPs that walked in support of Ruth Smith, but it was an extraordinary set of events that meant that we even had to go through this process and that he wasn't automatically disqualified. And I mentioned the Home Affairs Select Committee. They did that report. And at the time when they released their separate inquiry, a parliamentary inquiry into anti-Semitism, they reported a poll which showed that people who joined the Labour Party after the 2015 general election found support in the notion that anti-Semitism had been fabricated by Corbyn's detractors. And at that time, 55% of Labour Party members thought that it was something that had been made up. That it wasn't a problem at all, and it was being hyped up to both undermine Jeremy Corbyn or to stifle legitimate criticism of Israel. And just to be very clear at this point, this never had anything to do with Israel. Of all my experiences of the things that I saw, very few things, I mean, I'd say less than 5% had anything to do with what was going on in the Middle East. The overwhelming majority of it was anti-Semitism, pure and simple, nothing to do with the Middle East. Now, I'd like to report that you would hope that it might have improved as more examples surfaced. I focused here using the examples of Jeremy Corbyn himself, but I could probably give a 3-hour lecture of the countless examples that we know about of Labour Party members themselves who had propagated anti-Semitism, either in person, online. I'll share perhaps a few of them in a short while. And yet it got worse. There was a significant opinion poll that was just published just the other week, and it showed that 73% of all Labour Party members today think that the issue of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party is either invented or wildly exaggerated by the media and opponents of Jeremy Corbyn. And that's particularly challenging for me, who's someone who's dedicated their whole life to the Labour Party and never in a million years wanted this to consume all of my life and to see my party being taken over in this way. When the Chakrabarti report came out, it was actually the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Ephraim Mervis, who said that the credibility of that report lay in tatters. And there was many different issues that came as a result of it. And I've touched on some of the things myself that I experienced. It wasn't just me. I showed you in that photograph, you can see Ruth Smith. There was a big issue, and in fact, we've had a very specific conference in the United Kingdom. It was the SARA conference to talk about the intersectionality between misogyny and anti-Semitism, because it's been disproportionately the women representatives that have faced this level of abuse. Many of my male colleagues themselves have noted that having seen or just had a small insight into what we've been on the receiving end of, that they themselves had only received a fraction of what we received. Ruth Smith herself received, they believe, in one summer 25,000 pieces of anti-Semitic abuse, both physical and virtual, over the summer of 2016. And in the wake of that event, she was placed under police protection when someone claiming to be a Jeremy Corbyn supporter threatened to murder her. Another female Jewish colleague, Margaret Hodge, she confronted Jeremy Corbyn in 2018. She was then threatened with an investigation and with deselection. And she got a litany of abuse from Labour Party supporters and members and people that tried to remove her as both the MP and as a candidate. And my parliamentary neighbour in Liverpool, a wonderful woman called Dame Louise Elman, she was given a damehood for her public service. She's served for many decades in public office. She did so much, but she was an outspoken critic too of Jeremy Corbyn, and she was the victim of a very concerted hate campaign by his supporters, culminating in a no-confidence motion, which they scheduled to take place on Yom Kippur. So for anyone who's not Jewish, it's the Jewish Day of Atonement, it's the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, and they organised to have a vote against her in her local constituency party on a day when she was unable to attend. My good friend and colleague Dame Louise Elman decided that she wouldn't be running for election again, I think in part because of some of the abuse that she was subject to, and also because of the rise of anti-Semitism that she faced under Jeremy Corbyn. And there was many things that happened, but this was probably one of the worst. And in terms of what precipitated the events that I showed you at the start, that big demonstration in Parliament Square, it was this mural. I don't know if anyone's heard about the mural, but this mural was found on a wall in East London. And in 2012, the mayor of this area in Tower Hamlets decided that this was anti-Semitic, and he gave the owner of the private wall 28 days to paint over it or to explain himself to the police. The mural was painted by a Los Angeles-based artist known as Mir One, and it was gone within days. And few people mourned the destruction of this piece of, I'm not going to call it art, but this mural. And this was particularly significant because it was on the walls of the East, it was on the walls of Brick Lane, which is in the East End of London. And the East End of London is where thousands of Jews who were escaping pogroms in the Russian Empire after 1885 came to. Some kept on going and arrived here in the USA, but many settled in London and created the famous Jewish community of the East End, including my very own family. This is where they came first to Britain. But as you can see from this image, the mural shows a very clear anti-Semitic trope depicting Jewish financiers playing a game of Monopoly on the backs of the poor. And Mayor Rahman, who wasn't seen as a very natural ally of the Jewish community, he was actually from the far left Respect Party, but he said that mural perpetrated anti-Semitic propaganda about conspiratorial Jewish domination of financial and political institutions. Now, that should have been the end of a very shameful message. However, it was in 2018 that a message on a Facebook page from 6 years earlier resurfaced, and that is the comment you see in the top right-hand corner. It was discovered that Jeremy Corbyn himself had written on a Facebook post in support of that mural, in support of the artist, rather than in support of it being taken down. Those comments were brought to my attention early one Friday morning. It was in February 2018 when I was feeding my baby, and I requested an explanation for what this was all about. I didn't get one. I kept on asking. I was told he was too busy to respond. So I took to Twitter and I tweeted about it. And I tweeted that I'd asked the leader's office for an explanation about this Facebook post, and I'm still waiting for a response. And it took 4 responses from Jeremy Corbyn's office to apologise for the comments that he put supporting that mural. The Jewish Labour movement, of which I was parliamentary chair, said that anti-Semitic art is anti-Semitism and it cannot be defended under any circumstances, because Jeremy Corbyn's first instinct was to talk about his concerns about freedom of speech. And this was perpetrated even further by the fact that the artist, who denied all allegations of anti-Semitism, he undermined his case because he made that statement exclusively to the notorious Jew-hating website, the David Icke website, which people in the room may be aware of. There was many different things that flowed from this mural, and it was discovered that there were Labour Party members across the country who defended Jeremy Corbyn's comments. There were Labour Party members that said that they didn't see what the problem was with it. There was a Labour Party member in Devon who the Times reported said he thought it was a great mural, that it should be preserved rather than painted over. And there was then stories that emerged of the Labour Party head office protecting those people that had come out in support of the mural. And for many of us, it was an image, it was an underlying trope, and it was straight from the pages of Nazi propaganda. Yet, Jeremy Corbyn chose to side with the artist, not the Jewish community. And to this day, myself and others never got a proper apology for the comments that he wrote in support of that mural. And that's why we took to Parliament Square just 4 days later after this mural surfaced. And as I said, just for 1,500 people to gather with just a few days' notice, it really was an unprecedented action, and it was inconceivable at any other point in the history of British politics. Now, I'd like to report that it made a difference for us to come together. I think for any rational organisation to get such bad press, to have such a demonstration outside the House of Commons, you would have anticipated that the Labour Party would have done everything within its power to try and contend with this issue. And yet, regrettably, things sadly only got worse. And in fact, it was that year that I saw the greatest volume and the greatest toxicity of the stuff that was put online, particularly in the wake of that demonstration. There was a whole host of Labour Party members, some in elected office, who were identified as espousing these anti-Semitic views or sharing anti-Semitic posts, and it's to the credit of the Times newspaper in London and the Sunday Times that they were very, very dogged about focusing on this issue and exposing all of these different cases. There was lots of issues around closed Facebook groups. I know you have a similar conversation here in the States about what's being hosted online, many of it private, some of it these secret closed groups. But there was many things that were, particularly on social media, which were difficult to control. Here's an example of something that was directed. Kayla Bibby was a member in Liverpool Riverside, which was the neighbouring constituency to me, Louise Elman's constituency. This is an image from a far-right website, but it was shared by a prominent Labour Party member in Liverpool, Kayla Bibby. And there was a whole raft of evidence that came to light of the Labour Party not seeking to hold this member to account for putting this all over social media. For anyone that heard the earlier presentation, and thank you to Philip for sharing your insight, we had a whole programme. It was called Panorama, and it's akin to your 60 Minutes. It's probably one of the most significant documentaries that we have in Britain that dedicated a whole hour to exposing what was going on within the Labour Party. And there were some very brave whistleblowers who were working and paid by the Labour Party that exposed the volume of the complaints that were being made and how badly or poorly they were handled, if they were really handled at all. We also had the despicable challenge of another member of Parliament, not just Jeremy Corbyn, but this individual, a man called Chris Williamson. Chris Williamson, thankfully today, is not a member of Parliament. He made many comments that were seen and believed to be anti-Semitic, and yet 28 constituency parties across our country passed motions in support of him, everywhere from Bristol through to Cornwall, to Gloucester, to Sheffield, which showed the depth and extent to which this issue was percolating throughout the Labour Party. And we have an organisation in the UK called the Community Security Trust, and they did a report to show that they identified 36 pro-Jeremy Corbyn Twitter accounts that were routinely spreading anti-Jewish racism. And if you're interested, you can read that report. It's called Engines of Hate. But those 36 accounts, many of those accounts were shared by people at the very highest levels of the Labour Party, elected members on the National Committee, elected members of Parliament. And so it came to the moment where, despite my very best efforts, everyone says, you should fight, stay within the tent. I am all for staying in the tent if you can make a change. And I can say hand on heart, I did more than any other person to try and make the situation better. But sadly, it only got worse. And I knew that I couldn't, in good faith, at a future general election, knock on doors and say, vote for me as your local member of Parliament, but by extension, get this guy in number 10. Not to say that the guy we've got at the moment, Boris Johnson's, any better. He's for different reasons, he's not great. However, I just couldn't be part of that project. I couldn't do that. So in fact, it was a year ago on Tuesday. I was 36 weeks pregnant, and this is a picture of me leading the press conference when myself and, at that moment, 6 others left the Labour Party because enough really had been enough, and we decided we'd done everything possible to try and affect things from within. And again, as you heard within the opening remarks, I believed at that moment that the Labour Party was institutionally anti-Semitic, and I could no longer be a part of it. I should add, it was bad enough to deal with the threats and the challenges that I received when I was in Westminster, but it was also amplified by my experience locally in Liverpool. And I'm not going to take you through the whole history books, but suffice to say, in Liverpool we have historically an organisation called Militant, who was on the far left within the Labour Party in the 1980s. And there was many people expelled from the Labour Party in the 1980s that were part of the Militant. And when Jeremy Corbyn came back in, these people were given a space and were allowed to to come back into the Labour Party. So I would have, in my weekly meetings, people, when I came home to Liverpool, sat in my meetings that were in the history books from the militant days, or in the history books from the Socialist Worker Party, and they made things very, very difficult. I wanted to run campaigns on serious issues like food poverty, and I was constantly being undermined by people who saw me as an obstacle to world revolution. And things got so bad during that time that also, this was a very difficult experience. At my own party political conference, I had to have a police escort outside of the secure zone, and this picture was dominated the press at the time. I wasn't going to be held away from my own party political conference because it was in Liverpool, the city which I represented, but it was determined that I had to have support at that time. It was very, very, very difficult. And yet, in spite of that, there were people that propagated conspiracies to say that I paid that police person, or that police person was in fact an actor. There was websites, there's a number of far-left websites, they're called Squawkbox, Novara Media, The Canary, and they said that I essentially fabricated the whole thing. Because there was one photograph that kind of didn't have the police with me from a specific angle, that they had like 500 photographs, but one photo didn't have the police in the photograph just because of the specific angle. That meant there wasn't actually any police, and it was all a fabrication. And at the same time, the Metropolitan Police confirmed they were investigating a social media post from a Labour Party member who called me a Zionist extremist and who said that I was about to get a good kicking. That threat was reported to the Labour Party headquarters 7 months previously, but they didn't tell me about it, and they didn't tell the police about it. And the only reason why the police were then investigating it was because someone leaked a dossier of all the internal complaints to one of our national radio stations. It's a radio station called LBC, and it's only because the press got hold of this dossier that meant that the police then went on to investigate. And it looks very likely that this individual will now be prosecuted as a result of that threat that they posted online. This was then on the front page of the Times at that moment in November. Labour concealed anti-Semitic threat against Jewish MP. It was covered in quite a number of different newspapers. I also had the particular challenge locally of my own chair. So the person who was elected to chair my local constituency party, an individual called Alex Scott Samuel, he was a former academic, and he had appeared on not one but two shows broadcast by conspiracy theorist David Icke, who I mentioned before. He claimed that the Rothschild family behind a lot of the neoliberal influence in the UK and the US, and that was happening in my very back garden. He believes that the Rothschilds are, in fact, secretly ruling the world. And they also brought a motion, or they tried to bring a motion of no confidence against me when I was very heavily pregnant, which was promoted locally by again, another individual who we call the 9/11 truthers, who also called me a disruptive Zionist. And these are the very same people whose values I'm supposed to have shared. We're all supposed to be in this party that believes in equality and anti-racism against all, and yet this is what was happening. So I left, and since then I haven't looked back. As I said, at that press conference, if you want to, you can see the whole speech that I gave at the time. I said that I cannot remain in a party that I've come to the sickening conclusion is institutionally anti-Semitic. And as a result of which, I might not have won my own battle because I stand before you today and I wasn't re-elected. I didn't get to return to the House of Commons, but I certainly won the war to ensure that Jeremy Corbyn doesn't today sit in number 10 as our Prime Minister, which could have happened. The Labour Party suffered the worst defeat it's ever experienced since 1935 in our December election that just went past. The Conservatives won seats from Labour, which the Labour Party had held since the 1920s. And it was a wipeout. And Jeremy Corbyn's unpopularity was a very decisive factor. His legacy, aside from electoral failure, is a party riddled with racism and a hostile environment for Britain's Jews. Now, in the wake of that election defeat, the Labour Party is now engaged in a protracted internal leadership contest. So as the Labour Party lost, they're now going through the process of selecting a new leader. And I just wanted to share with you, because I think, in terms of turning the corner and what might happen going forward, I want to kind of now focus on some of the kind of positives, because I appreciate that my remarks are pretty downbeat. I just wanted to share with you, there was in the past week a hustings event, like a public, like you just had your debate amongst your Democratic leadership candidates, and that's going on at the moment in Britain. And there was a public event which was coordinated by the Jewish Labour movement, and all of the potential candidates to be, or the potential leaders, the candidates to be leader, were asked to share their remarks. And I think it's helpful for you to hear from a non-Jewish member, one of those candidates, Lisa Nandy, on her reflections on where the Labour Party is today and what might happen next. So this is about a 4-minute clip. Also, these are just some headlines of what happened within my own local constituency party. This is what I was experiencing. So I had my 4 days in Westminster, Monday to Thursday. I'd go back to Liverpool, and this is what I'd experience over the course of a weekend. So this is Lisa Nandy, and I'll just play you. This was just last week.
I'm ashamed of where this party has got to, where we've lost all of our moral authority over this issue, and more than that we've caused real damage to people out there in the country. I'm angry about that too, and I'm really, really sorry. But you deserve more than my anger and my sorrow. As many of my friends who've had to bear the brunt of fighting these battles on the front line over the last few years, Luciana, Ruth, Louise, who haven't just had to fight racism, they've had to fight misogyny as well in our party. As they have said to me many, many times before, what they want most is honesty, and they want action. And anti-Semitism, let's be honest, is a particular sort of racism. It is different to other sorts of racism. It is the sort of racism that punches up, not down, that argues that Jewish people are privileged and powerful, and because there are people on the left who believe that their job is to challenge privilege and power, therefore wrongly and disgracefully argue that Jewish people are a legitimate target for racism. That is what has been allowed to enter our party, and it is a poison. It is the canary in the coal mine, and unless it is addressed, it will poison us and everything that we do. And that is why, when I served in the shadow cabinet, the only time I broke collective responsibility and spoke out against my own party leadership was when there was a high-profile case of anti-Semitism and a complete and utter refusal to deal with it and to follow our rules and to issue a suspension from the top of the party. And by refusing to speak out, we gave the green light to anti-Semites that they had a natural home in the Labour Party. And I spoke out because not to do so would have made me complicit in something I wasn't prepared to tolerate. Now, Luciana said to me not long after that, this cannot be my fight alone. I understood that, and I recognised that. I recognised that because I know what racism feels like. I'm half Indian, and my dad has experienced racism all his life. And it should never be left to those who are dealing with this and experiencing this to fight those battles. So whether it was on the mural, on the definition of anti-Semitism, or on those brave, brave whistleblowers who spoke out from the Labour Party, I have stood up and spoken out over and over again, because this will never be your fight alone. So let me say this. Honesty is needed, a reckoning with how badly we have let you down, and action is necessary. As a bare minimum, I will implement the EHRC recommendations, but that is a minimum, and that is my promise to you. And I will implement an independent process, because never ever again should we or can we allow factions or friends of the leadership to interfere in our fight against racism in all its forms and in tackling anti-Semitism? That is my promise to you, and I'll tell you why. One, because it's the right thing to do, and you are owed and deserve this. As the affiliate that helped to found this party, you are owed nothing less. But two, because this is existential for the Labour Party. We cannot claim to be the party that will build a more compassionate, fairer, equal society, free from discrimination, if we cannot even get this right in our own party. I have spoken out over and over again over the last 3 years. At times I've been told I will be deselected for doing it, but I promise you, never again will people like me, and most of all, like many of you in this room, be forced to choose between standing up for what is right and standing up for the Labour Party. That is the leadership I will show.
So I just wanted to share that with you, because that's what's just happened in the last week within the Labour Party. And she mentioned in the EHRC, so the Labour Party is in the extraordinary situation of being formally investigated by our Equalities and Human Rights Commission. That body was set up by the previous Labour government, by Tony Blair, to ensure that as a country we tackled all forms of racism. And yet it's that very body that today is investigating the Labour Party and is widely expected, when it reports in just a few months' time, to find, as I've alluded to today, issues to do with racism within the Labour Party. But certainly it will provide a moment at which there'll be choices that will have to be made, and that candidate certainly has been very clear in the position that she set out about what she will do when the Equalities and Human Rights Commission reports. So I just want to conclude with, what are the lessons that we can draw from all of this? I appreciate we're thousands of miles away in the United Kingdom. What are the lessons that can be learned? As I started my remarks, I certainly have experienced anti-Semitism from the far right, but also from not just the far left, but the left as well. So, we always have to remain on our guard. Anti-Semitism on the left exists in full view and is as every bit pernicious as the vile anti-Semitism that we see on the right. And it can't be excused if it comes from supposed liberals and if it's wrapped up in the discourse of anti-colonialism or anti-capitalism. I think too the IHRA definition for us in our country certainly has been very helpful, because it outlines the contours of new anti-Semitism, and certainly it's been very important to ensure that we can hold people to account. It's not a binding definition, but it continues to form the basis of international work to tackle anti-Semitism. Thirdly, I think we need eternal vigilance, and that's why the conference that's going on at the moment is so important. That constant monitoring of online and face-to-face hater messages, with those sources being called out every time. I mean, that's the challenge, and certainly some of the experiences of what I've had and faced over the last few years have been made worse by the fact that not enough people in elected office have, as Lisa referred to, joined me in that fight. It can never be the Jewish community's fight alone to tackle racism, in the same way that it can't be the black community's fight alone to tackle racism that they experience as well. We need to find allies. And certainly in the UK, we've got a very small but important army of people who are online heroes doing a really important job of challenging and calling out this stuff every single time that they experience it or they find it. Fifthly, it's different.
I'm ashamed.
Sorry. Oh, the picture's not on here. I'm awfully sorry. But certainly, again, I've always used the full force of the law. I happen to be very fortunate in that I have a voice. I served as a member of Parliament. I always used that voice and that platform when I experienced racism. I happen to be pretty resilient, although I'm conscious that at any moment that might not be the case. And I'm also very fortunate that I've had beside me a wonderful team. I've got close family and friends that are by my side. But it's important to call this stuff out, because in Britain, we hear the victim impact statements that I've heard read out in court when I've had to give evidence of people who haven't had that strength. And it's important because these things can have, even when they happen online, can have far-reaching consequences that impact on people's ability to go to work, their ability to maintain relationships with their family and friends, can result in mental illness as well. So these things need to be called out. And where we have laws in place, whether it's my country or your country, to use them to hold people to account. And fifth, and just finally, it's about having that robust academic discourse around anti-Semitism, which recognises its constant shifting forms and its constant shifting tropes, which again is what this conference is focusing on, which develops our understanding of the intersectionality between anti-Semitism and misogyny, or anti-Semitism and other forms of oppression, because we always need to be vigilant. This conference is a really great example of that last point. And it really has been a pleasure for me to join you here today. And just to share, it has just been a snapshot of my experience with you this evening. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for those people that across Europe and your country are doing such important work that I know you're going to take forward after our time here together. And for those of you that will be at the conference tomorrow, I hope that you have a very, very successful day, and I'm sorry that I have to get back on a plane to go back to my family, but thank you very much for having me.